So Mayor, I'd like to bring you in here. So Saeed's explained there some of these laws of exception and the way that they've been used to target individuals. You in particular have written about the targeting of the political opposition in Tunisia, which of course includes your father, who is the leader of the Nahda party. Can you explain what's happening here? And what's the rationale behind the targeting of the political opposition? And if you could perhaps explain a little about to what extent you think this is a directed policy of the president versus a broader program developed by state officials.
Hello, thank you very much, Tim, and many thanks to Chatham House for this opportunity to discuss the situation in Tunisia. In answer to your question, Tim, Qais Said is currently cracking down on all his dissidents, all those who oppose his coup, foremost, of course, my father, who is the elected leader of the dissolved parliament and leader of the largest political party in the country, another. Why is he doing that? Because he wants to establish an authoritarian regime where all power rests with himself, executive, legislative, and judicial, through the use of the police and the judiciary. Today, we have over 30 prominent dissidents in jail on politically motivated charges. Politicians, lawyers, civil society activists, journalists, trade unionists, and we have the feminist activist Syumia Isa. The objective is to empty the political landscape of all parties and organizations because Said simply does not believe in organized political parties and wants to establish a one-man rule, Gaddafi style. Said excelled in exploiting crises and deepening tensions. He invested in the health crisis with the COVID epidemic, the financial crisis, and of course the political crisis with his incessant conflicts with parliament and the government he himself appointed, I might add. He used these crises as a justification for his power grab. He implemented his coup in stages. Initially, he started by freezing, then dissolving parliament using Article 80 of the Constitution to claim that his move is perfectly constitutional and legitimate, and then went on to scrap the Constitution altogether, writing his own, literally. He then dissolved all check and balanced institutions, notably the Supreme Judicial Council, again creating his own instead, and went about harassing judges in one single presidential decree, dismissing 57 of them in one go. After that, he set about engineering his own rather bizarre political system, a hyper-presidential, hyper-centralized system that revolves around himself. And this paved the ground for the current crackdown on the opposition, with not just arrests, but closing down of political headquarters of those of Ennahda and the NSF, the National Salvation Front. You ask me, are these policies those of Qais Said or state officials? Well, such a distinction no longer exists in Tunisia, really. Said is currently the state. Of course, whether he is using the deep state or it is using him is another question. What is clear for the time being is that both are very happy to be using each other, united around one objective, which is restoring the old dictatorship. Qais Said offered Tunisians a deal to get rid of parliament, the constitution, political parties, and in return, which he dismissed as being the root of all evils and the root of all misery, and get prosperity and wealth in return. And then what happened? He robbed Tunisians of their hard-won freedoms and gave them not only dictatorship, but poverty and bankruptcy instead. And I'd like to say a few words about Europe's. Currently, he's trying to get Europe's support by turning Tunisia into a massive detention center, an open-air prison for Tunisian and African migrants. And we might comment on the European delegation to Tunisia. led by Bologna recently. Do we have time for that?
We're going to come back to that. So I'd like to just park that there, if I may. This is clearly going to be a point of discussion, which we will certainly come back to.
Well, I think there was a widespread belief that Qais Said enjoys widespread popularity, huge popularity, but I think that turned out to be an illusion with the recent legislative elections, which were boycotted by around 90% of Tunisians. So we had elections without voters. Qais Said saw Tunisians a lie, in fact, the propaganda machine, which was very hostile to the democratic nascent democracy, the democratic transition, sold this lie that parliament was the problem, democracy was the problem, and that if you if you gave away democracy, if you got rid of democracy and parliament, we would get prosperity and economic affluence. But that turned out to be a lie. Tunisians are realizing now that they lost these very hard-won freedoms and gained nothing. They have to queue up daily for basic supplies, and that's unprecedented in Tunisia's modern history, for sugar, bread, oil, the most basic needs. The propaganda machine spread the belief that Nahda had failed economically, that these governments that came after the revolution failed economically. And it would have been possible to accept that in 2022, for instance. But we saw what happened after in the last 4 years, and 2 years with Said having absolute power, with all power residing in his hand, he turned these economic difficulty. And now people are realizing that the counter-propaganda, the revolution counter-propaganda machine, what it has been describing as the Black Decade, has in fact been a bright decade where they enjoyed freedoms. No one was in jail for their opinions, for writing a Facebook post, as is the case today. And the economic situation was much better than it is today, even within, if we understand the context of the turbulent environment, regional environment Tunisia finds itself in, with a civil war on its borders, and the incessant daily strikes. I mean, recently, the head of the UGTT, which is the largest trade union in Tunisia, declared proudly that he said, and I quote, "We would not let them breathe." Talking about the governments, the post-revolution governments, we would not let them breathe. That we had daily strikes, paralyzing the public sector, this affected the economy. We had a flight of investors, and of course, Morocco benefited a great deal from that. So even with all those conditions, the conditions of a transitional phase, a very delicate transitional phase, and a very sensitive regional environment, the economy was performed much better prior to the coup. And so Tunisians can see that they lost their freedoms and gained nothing.